Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer, author, Tiffany Murray, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Has written quite a few novels already, but has just recently published a book titled My Family and Other Rock Stars. It tells of her childhood growing up at Rockfield's studio. This is when her mother got a job there in the early 70s and was the cook for all the people who went and recorded at Rockfield. So look, this is the interview. After several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years, which is a little bit different with Tiffany because she was living with rock stars, really. Anyway, Tiffany, it's over to you.
You know, I would definitely say before these musicians came to live in my mum's house that she would constantly play Lou Reed's Transformer and David Bowie's Hunky Dory. So those were the albums that woke me up. And of course, I'm the generation, as many generations above me too, where we're album kids. It's not just about that one song. It's about overhearing your parents playing the entire side one, side two. So definitely Transformer and Hunky Dory were the ones that woke me up before the bands actually came into our house.
Yes. So do you want to just give us a little bit of a background to Rockfields? Because it's a kind of a fascinating place that one's seen documentaries on it and how your mother and you sort of ended up living in such a sort of iconic studio. Because there are these studios that I've, found, not personally, but, doing interviews with people, that are quite famous. But this one is one of the big ones, isn't it, in that sense of being completely bonkers, really?
Well, yes. I mean, Rockfield, it's still very much a working studio. It's still very much a working farm. And that's how it started in the 60s. It was a farm owned by two brothers and obviously their parents. And they loved Elvis Presley. They formed a band called the Charles and Kingsley Combo because they were called Charles and Kingsley Ward. They went up to London, to EMI to try and seek their fortune, everything like that. But what they found was actually getting studio space was very hard and very expensive. So they put, as you probably, anybody who's watched the documentary, they put pig feed bags in the attic of their parents' house and they built a little studio for themselves and they recorded there themselves. And then gradually that ballooned over the years because you got Dave Edmonds, who was a local musician, and he was the one that said, because it was called Future Sounds, and he said to the brothers, hold on, why don't you call it Rockfield? Because the local village is called Rockfield. So that's where the name comes from. And they gradually, over the years, transformed various outbuildings into studios. So you've got Studio 1 and you've got Studio 2. Studio 1 is called the Quadrangle. And gradually, all of these bands and primarily record companies heard about the place, and it was the world's first residential recording studio. But myself and my mother, we got there in a sort of backwards way, in that she, first of all, in her house in Herefordshire, desperately needed money. So put an advert in the paper that said rehearsal space for bands, no heavy rock. And the first band to come and rehearse with us rather than record were Black Sabbath. Yes. So it sort of worked from that point on. And then we had Queen and a gorgeous Irish band called Horselips, a brilliant forgotten band called Tracks. Do look them up. You can find a few of their videos on YouTube. And then these bands going to Rockfield to record after rehearsing raved about my mother's food. So that's when it was Kingsley who called her up and said, hey, Joan, do you want to come and work for us as the Cordon Bleu chef? And that's how it all began.
So then you moved into the to this sort of the environment and to Rockfields. So whereabouts? Did they get you a I'm sure it's in the book actually, but did they get you yes, a place in the on the sort of on the site itself actually?
Well, that's why I thought this book would work in terms of a child's memories of these bands in this place in the 70s and early 80s, because we lived with them. There were two other families at Rockfield, Charles's family and Kingsley's family. So there were 5 other kids, but they all lived in their own houses. So Mum and I, we were housed with the bands in this line of chalets. So next door we could have Freddie Mercury or, we weren't living there when Iggy Pop was there, so I'm quite glad about that.
Yes.
As much as I love Iggy, it would have been a bit manic. But during the 70s, we lived there. And so they would be either side of us because the chalets were just converted stables. So there was a little chalet next door, all connected. And Mum's kitchen was right in the corner. And then Studio One was right next to the kitchen through the rehearsal room. So we lived with these bands. And that's why I thought, My Family and Other Rock Stars, which is what the book ended up being called, could be a particular story.
Yes, well,
because, because it is about, you're sitting there as a kid, maybe playing with the dog, this wonderful black lab, Jason, whilst Freddie Mercury is composing bits of Bohemian Rhapsody in the stable, playing his piano or doing all the layers of Galileo with all the band, and it's not just about that. It's about a family forming, and it's about the 1970s, which now is history, very much so.
Well, yes.
So I wanted to try and capture all that through the story of these amazing tracks being laid in the studio.
Yes, absolutely. And just on that personal level, so you went there with your mum, living there. So you then had to go to the local school and went through up to, did you then do O-levels or CSCs at that stage? Did you manage to keep a sort of focus on your childhood and studying?
Well, that's what a lot of people ask me is, did you want to become a musician? And, all of this. The man who ended up being my stepfather, Fritz, who we met at the studio, who was a producer, he tried to teach me the guitar. He tried to teach me the bass, even the drums. And I think, like most kids, the way I reacted to my childhood was by being a bit of a swot. So deeply, deeply uncool. So I was quite dedicated to school because maybe, I'm sure a therapist would say, well, that was your order, that was your structure to the day. And I was very much, my mother always used to call me a goody-goody. You're such a goody-goody, Tiffany, because I'd always want to, please the teacher and do my homework and underline my titles like a goody-goody. So I must have been a complete nightmare.
Yes. Yes. Well, I guess it was quite good. It gave you that stability or that focus at such an age, because I suppose it would have been very easy to have got into lots of temptations. And being in the 70s, I mean, there probably wasn't anything remotely like a DBS check or safeguarding issues. So,
oh my God, no.
Just because kind of curious, and I know it slightly runs. So then you do your O levels. Do you then go to A levels and then leave for university during the 80s?
Yes, I did. And the end of the book is that transition period. I had a year off in between A levels and university, and I worked in Florida as a nanny, just earning money for all that future stuff. And it's quite, I won't say what it is, but it's quite an important part of the narrative of the book because it involves the band, as in the band called The Band, as in Bob Dylan and the band, and how important that band was to my listening history and to our family forming. So it's that point is really important. And then, yes, I mean, it's not in the book, but my own personal history is I went to New York and I did a PhD in Caribbean literature. And then I went, as we discussed off air, I went to Norwich.
Yes,
and I did another PhD in in critical and creative writing, and then I'm a novelist, so I've written 3 other novels before I came to this memoir.
And then did you get to that point where, I mean, with the passing of time, it's quite interesting, I find, because when things have just happened, it's just too raw and it's still too there, and you can't have any reflection, and there's not that sort of period of time that's been and gone. But then did you start thinking more about, because one of your novels was kind of based a little bit on the story, which obviously is great for was it your first novel you did?
That was my second novel, Diamond Star Halo. It's set at a place called Rock Farm. So you can imagine that's the imaginative distance. No, but in all seriousness, the narrative of it is completely fictional. But it's just the place. That's what I love to do, is I love to lock these novels in places I know. So coming to memoir, and dealing with these stories of Black Sabbath and Queen and, obviously Horselips, but then later Teardrop Explodes and David Bowie, when David Bowie turned up at Rockfield. That's a different thing. You have to honour what really happened.
Yes, that's absolutely. So when did you have that light bulb moment and think, right, it's going to be the memoir of my childhood? Did this happen during lockdown, or was that before lockdown?
It happened over a number of years, because it really is tied to me interviewing my mother. She's 81 now, and about 10 years ago, my stepfather died. No, he died 16 years ago. And then about 6 years after that, I thought, I've got to get these stories from Mum. I think maybe a lot of kids my age, in our 50s, we see the passage of time and we want to hold on to the past, or at least the stories of the past. I'm an only child. I don't have any cousins. So I was like, I want to see what she has to say about what she did at this particular time, how she fed these anthems, classics and one-hit wonders. And the book's filled with all of her recipes, like what she cooked for Queen when they were recording Bohemian Rhapsody, etc.
Yes,
and so it began with that. It began with me interviewing her. And then really through my other writing projects, this was always the project that, agents were interested in. But I wanted it to come at the proper time for me and my family, so I could make sense of what happened.
Yes, absolutely. You must have been. Did you find more stories about your mum that you hadn't sort of realised during the interviews with her?
Yes, definitely. This book is from a child's point of view. So there are certain things that I can't put in there because it's from a child's point of view. So one of the things she said when she did finally read it, it took her a while, not because she felt anything about it, just purely because she was, I'm too busy going out to lunch, and, she has her own life, was that she fed back to me, well, you could have put some of my adventures that I had in it, Tiffany. And I was like, well, Mum, it's from a kid's point of view. I'm not going to say all the things you did behind the scenes. I think that might be your book. So
yes,
there's still a lot. There's a lot to tell.
A lot to tell. And what was your mum's sort of story? I mean, obviously she's kind of critical to the book because, she's the person who learns to cook. How did she develop her cooking skill? Because being sort of from that sort of generation, cooking was it was a bit basic, wasn't it? I remember my mum, listening to Radio 2 in the kitchen during the 60s, during the latter part, and there'd be, was it David Hamilton, one of those, what's the recipe today? One of those Radio 2 ones, and she'd be scribbling on bits of paper these recipes that she'd put in her drawer and then leave them. And she's still got this very early Delia Smith pamphlet, and it was quite sweet, But cooking, and there was Fanny Craddock, but cooking wasn't much of a thing, And your mum would have been during the war years and post-war years where there was very little food. There was no cheese. Well, there was a little bit of cheese, wasn't there? A little bit of anything, dodgy sort of meat and dodgy fish. So how did your mum become so interested in cooking?
Well, first of all, she was a farmer's daughter. So she grew up on a farm, even though she went to boarding school. She says her memory is coming home as a 12-year-old and having to do things like cook Christmas lunch because my grandmother had taken to her bed, or deal with the village who'd come to the kitchen. because they were dealing with all the food that they had to cook from the animal, I'm a vegetarian at the moment myself, but the pig slaughtering time, etc. So she always had her hands in farmhouse cooking in the 40s and 50s, but then she discovered Elizabeth David, and in the late 50s, those were her two Bibles. I think it's French country cooking and Mediterranean cooking. I could have the title slightly wrong. But she said that what this introduced to her was an entirely new world, away from milk puddings. And there's a lot in the book with her recipes about her memory of those awful meals from school, like fish pie that has liver. Yeah, the liver, the leftover porridge in the fish pie. I mean, and pom potato and all this just post-war stuff, which people had to cope with because it was post-war. So she went to London and she went to the Cordon Bleu school, and that was her way out, she said. And then she became a 60s girl in London.
So was she quite swinging at that point? Was she?
Oh, yes. She was, yeah. She was, there was some wonderful photographs of her, in her Bieber dress and her pink, I don't know what hat, but, and she always used to tell me stories of, oh, yes, darling, that's when we lived there. And the Rolling Stones would come and they'd just play at these parties and then they'd go away again. And she would go and see Howling Wolf because, again, through the book is a little bit about her obsession with the blues.
Yes.
So she was very, I always think of her as Julie Christie in Darling, that
yes.
kind of over-the-top 60s girl.
So she was very tuned in, turned on, and sort of rocking, wasn't she, at that stage? I know, because that famous Rolling Stones album, Let It Bleed, that's the one with the cake that Delia Smith made, wasn't it? Which was quite a nice little touch. So she was, so it didn't faze her that suddenly she was at a rock, in the countryside on a farm again, because obviously she was aware, but then having the interest of meeting endless bands and musicians. And did this studio, from the documentary, it does pick up quite quickly, doesn't it? It doesn't. It suddenly it has. I was going to say a zeitgeist moment, but it still does, doesn't it? It still gets well used. And during that Black Sabbath period, were they the first band that went there?
Excuse me. I think the first band. It was Mott the Hoople and Elephant's Memory, tied to Dave Edmunds. Don't quote me on that because I'm not a Rockfield historian. But Black Sabbath did rehearse Paranoid in Studio 2 in the late 60s. So that they didn't record it there, but they rehearsed it there.
Yes.
And really, in terms of Mum and her food and the musicians, I suppose the part that she very much remembers was trying to impress Queen, which they were so tied up with what they were doing that most of these musicians, the food was either something that they either ignored or they felt they had to go and eat something in order to work. So she would do over the top things like crepe Suzette at the table with all the flames to try and impress them. And whether it did or not, I don't know. But she said Queen were always very polite, and Freddie and Brian always said, thank you very much. But then she was, with certain record companies, she was paid extra money to get food into certain musicians. So, for instance, when Motorhead were there and my stepfather Fritz was producing them after Dave Edmunds couldn't cope, she was paid extra money to get some food into Lemmy, and she sat him down at the table and said, okay, what about Bœuf Bourguignon? And he, said... He obviously said, don't be silly, Joan. There were other words involved.
Yes.
And in the end, it came to the point where he said, all right, he poured out half a pint of Jack Daniels and said, if you drink that, I'll eat whatever you put in front of me. And she did try, but she only got halfway down the glass. So in the end, their compromise was apparently bacon sandwiches, but with the crusts cut off and with the bacon well done to burnt and lots of salty butter. So yes. I had to deliver that to the studio and to Animal and Lemmy outside Studio 2 as a kid. So,
my God. And was Fast Eddie there as well at that stage?
I don't know. I mean, or I remember, because at that time, 75, I was about 6. I certainly remember Lemmy, and I certainly remember Animal, because there was a story that Fritz had to get him from prison to come, and he redid all the drum bits, because it was called On Parole originally, and then it was shelved. But Animal used to walk around with no clothes on, so I certainly remember that as a kid.
Yes, that is strange. And there was also that kind of, I didn't realise it was taken at Rockfield. There's a very iconic picture of Hawkwind, isn't there, as well? At and I always wonder where that scene was from, because there's the barns as well. So you were really young. You were sort of like 6 in 1975. So this must have.
So it was until I think my mum stopped working for Rockfield about 82. So I think the last band she cooked for were Bauhaus. So it really, it's that coming of age story through these bands, and then suddenly the light switch comes on for me as a music lover, and with my own music.
Yes.
When you have Adam and the Ants sitting on the 5-bar gate, or Bauhaus up at Little Anchor, or Teardrop Explodes with beautiful Julian Cope riding around in his Jeep, or Echo and the Bunnymen and that amazing sound. So we, as the Rockfield kids, they were all a little bit older than me, the older girls, well, a lot older than me, really. I would just follow them. And when I had my coming of age with my bands, that was when everything changed. And I suddenly, the plate would shake in my hand as I served them supper, because I had crushes. And of course, these older Rockfield girls, the daughters of Charles Ward, Karina and Bridget, who were just wonderful sisters to me, they were the people, apart from my mother, who introduced me to David Bowie. So when David Bowie appeared at Rockfield, because he was helping to produce the Iggy Pop album Soldier, I mean, we all lost it completely. And we were just too nervous almost to go up to the quadrangle to see him.
Yes, that's amazing.
It's just too much.
I would imagine that was a very sort of curious time. But before then, I remember there was a little bit about seeing Shawaddy Waddy, quite different to Bowie, actually. So this is when you got an autograph of. So because I also remember sort of being very young when I heard them on Top of the Pops, thinking, this is great. Those 2 singles that you mentioned in the book that now completely escape me.
Under the Moon of Love is the main one. But they recorded that one album at Rockfield. But when I was a kid, I had a kid's taste, and I will not hear a bad word about Shawaddy Waddy to this day. I adore them. And that was my first band that I was completely nervous about meeting, and I begged my mother for their autograph, and it was rather embarrassing. But I remember being very distressed that they didn't look like Shawaddy Waddy.
No, you mentioned this in the book. They weren't there in their drapes, were they, doing their bit? But they are a delightful bunch of people.
Oh, they're wonderful.
And I remember sort of doing an interview with the lead singer, and I mean, it was quite interesting. I think they were one of the bands that a couple of the members appear on a Clash album in 1982, but I might be wrong.
Brilliant.
But they did. I think they just lived next door to Mick Jones in London, and they sort of appeared on one of their kind of side 2 tracks, and I think they were at the time, being the 70s, there was an awful lot of quite intentional race. I was going to say, a lot of racism and sexism, and sort of seeing a band with that sort of mixed lineup was quite radical at the time. I mean, football players would just be pelted with all sorts of abuse during the 70s, 80s, and probably the 90s. So Shawaddy Waddy are definitely there, and I do think most of those 70s bands initially might have been just we might have slightly laughed at them, but then with decades later, you think they've all got some classic songs, and they've done
wonderful. And Romeo, the drummer, he was just, even for a 6-year-old country kid, he was this pin-up, even though he was probably in his 30s then. But that song, Under the Moon of Love, just means so much to me, and it just conjures up that time. And I remember that album, and it's a painting of them all as little kids playing outside a cinema. And I remember staring at the their faces painted, and they're all sort of like street urchins playing with each other, and thinking, oh, they're about my age there.
Yes.
But of course they were, in their 30s, and it was this beautiful double album as well. So I just adore Showaddy Waddy. I think
yes, well, absolutely embrace it. So with the key part, well, not one of the key parts of the book is that relationship with your mum and Fritz. So how do they meet at the Rockfields, don't they? How does this kind of relationship sort of develop over the years and decades?
Well, they did actually meet at the Herefordshire house where Mum took in rehearsing bands, and Fritz was producing a band called Horselips, a fantastic band, so kind to us. And he came with his one ear up, one ear down, hopping black and white splotch dog, Boggle, who I fell in love with, even though Boggle wasn't the friendliest of dogs. Yes. He was one of those, intact males of a dog. But I was obsessed with dogs, so I would follow him about everywhere. My mother at that time hated Fritz because he wore open-toed sandals, which was the worst thing to do, apparently, according to my mother. And Boggle would come into her kitchen and cock his leg on her bag of onions. Yes. Onions, and so there were all these things against him. So when he came to Rockfield to record The Unfortunate Cup of Tea with Horselips, that's the name of that album, the second album he did with them, that's when it started. That's when their relationship started. And Fritz really immediately took over as my stepfather, in that he was from Lancashire.
Right.
Very, very, practical, down to earth. I was this slightly feckless southern child. I didn't know how to ride a bike or polish brass, as he said, or basically look after myself in any way, apart from just being slightly feral. So he taught me all those things. He taught me how to swim. He taught me how to train a dog, which was very important to me. Yes. But he, of course, had his own career in life. In the 60s, he was in a band called the Four Pennies. They had that song Juliet, and then that all stopped. So he had all this fame as a kid, and then that all stopped. So he knew he wanted to carry on in the music business. So that's when he became a producer. And, it wasn't always hugely successful, but as writing this book, I contacted various people like Graham Parker, who was lovely and remembered Mum and her food, and Brian May, who was just gorgeous. And one thing Brian said was that it was Fritz who convinced him to sing.
Right.
I said, what do you mean? He said, it was in the 60s when I was in this band Smile, and it was Fritz who took me to a basement studio. I don't know which studio, maybe it was Trident, I don't know, and persuaded him to sing this song, April Lady. He said, well, if you know where the tapes are, then have a look for them. And I did find them. And it's lovely. It's Fritz's writing on this old tape saying April Lady, Smile. So he did all these things. But then, as the book will tell you what happens. And it is about the ruthlessness of the music business as well, where you can yes, create these one-hit wonders, or these anthems, or these things that are just shelved by the record companies.
It's a cruel world. And what happened to your dad during this period? Does he completely disappear from the scene?
Well, that's another story. He's not. He doesn't appear in the book. No.
And he never appeared at Rockfields. And
no.
Well, that's curious. So yes, well, you were just saying you were like 6 about 1975. So yes, I just wondered if there was other kind of family dynamics that were coming in, but it was just mostly you, your mum, Fritz.
Just my mum's side of the family, and that's it. Yeah.
Yes. So with one of those kind of bits that everyone loves because it's David Bowie. You were 9 at that point, and he'd done his kind of albums. Well, I suppose he'd done the Berlin trilogy. He was probably just about to do Ashes to Ashes, and he was working all Guide and Iggy Pop at this point. So Iggy was doing was it Soldier album at this point? So he'd come off his kind of lust for life kind of moment, hadn't he? And the Idiot. So did Iggy stay there as well, or did they sort of? Because from the book, it seems like Bowie was there and gone almost overnight.
Well, Iggy was there for the whole time of Soldier, and the Bowie thing. Even remembering it and then interviewing people about it to try and get their memories, it's almost become this sort of mythical vortex thing where people can't agree on whether he was there for a week or a couple of weeks or 5 days, 3 days, 24 hours. It was definitely more than 24 hours because he was producing. Maybe Simple Minds might, because they were in Studio 2 at the same time, they might have a clearer idea. But I think because it was such an amazing moment when he arrived, and did he arrive being picked up by Sandra Ward, who was one of the wives of the two brothers, Charles Ward's wife. She apparently picked him up from Newport train station in her Volvo with the dog Jason in the back. Or did he arrive in a limo? I don't, but I love that because that's the point of this mythic story, is it can become any of them and all of them at the same time. But the fact was he was there and he was producing, and he did eat my mother's food, and the Simple Minds did do the backing tracks on backing vocals on one track, and it was an amazing time to think that he was just there.
It was, and I was just looking at the sort of lineup of the band. There's Glenn Matlock and another guy called Ivan who was in television, and Barry Andrews, who'd been in Magazine and Shriekback as well. So, yes, it was quite something, wasn't it, really?
Yeah.
The amount of musicians that just guided in. So you got to sort of see David and think, there you go, what colour eyes? You looked into his little eyes. That must have been quite something, actually. But one thing I have noticed, and your book kind of picks up on that kind of period, I think you mentioned Bow Wow Wow as well, is that, scenes last for such a short period of time, don't they? My brother, who was 7 years older than me, was into prog rock, and you think, prog rock's huge, but you think, actually, it was only a few years before it sort of fades into... actually prog rock becomes kind of embarrassing. The band's third or fourth album is just like terrible. You think, no, that was good, but this is not good. This is terrible. Your solo albums are not going to make you any money. And so scenes kind of move on so quickly. So that with the book, it has that moment where it's very 70s, isn't it? Very sort of denim, hairy chaps, no sort of personal hygiene, to suddenly like, oh, well, you've gone into that post-punk world of, Julian Cope and like I said, Bow Wow Wow being there as well. So it's interesting that suddenly you straddle that period of like 79. I always think, Thatcher gets in, then we have that period of the Falklands, the miners' strike, Greenham Common, and then that wave of kind of indie bands, and you've got Simple Minds appearing and Echo as well. And suddenly Rockfield kind of reinvents itself quite brilliantly at this stage. But you would have been older, so are your memories a bit more vivid during that sort of transition of the decades?
Definitely. There are certain moments in the book where I stumble upon the bands, or they come into my world, that mean so much more than, say, stumbling on a band from the 70s who are just men in my mother's world.
Yes.
It's a very weird, as the phrase is nowadays, disconnect. You go home to your bedroom, and there's, as the Echo and the Bunnymen track says, pictures on my wall. If you've got a picture of Echo and the Bunnymen or Julian Cope or Adam and the Ants on your wall, and then you go to Rockfield with your mother's food, and they're just standing there and they're eating it. It's just very weird. It's a very odd, you can't quite, as a 9 to 11-year-old, I just couldn't quite deal with it. It was I had to sort of hide myself away in myself as I was serving food. It's like I didn't want to talk to them because I didn't, couldn't deal with it. But there were certain moments that were really, really important. And it was the biggest spy you can ever find as a child in an adult's world.
Yes.
So that's what I loved to do, was spy on them as they were doing, their thing. And, it was the 70s and early 80s, and children were, seen and not heard. So it was easy to be a spy.
Well, absolutely. Because actually, yeah, you also have a Debbie Harry moment as well, don't you? She sort of looms big in your life, but obviously not at Rockfield, but just in the pop charts, which I think was my second ever single, was Denis by Debbie Harry. And I think I had to collect Walker's crisps to send away to get a poster of Debbie on my wall, which was, what you did for half a year to sort of get such an item through the post, which was always very, very exciting at that stage. So then, as that sort of period developed, obviously you were serving food. Does your mother's cooking change much at this point? Does she think, God, I've got to sort of up my game or change the game? Because obviously, tastes change. I mean, like gardening, there were certain fashions in the 70s and 80s, or even now, but then food also changes a lot as well. Did she keep up with the times?
Yes, she did. I mean, first of all, in the sort of mid to late 70s, she was very much introduced to vegetarian food by various bands and various producers. This producer called John Anthony. And, I remember her saying, well, I didn't know what I was doing, because she came from a Cordon Bleu tradition, and Robert Carrier over the top meat dishes and cream. She was like, I don't know. Oh, my avocado's ruined. But gradually she learned, because she's a cook, so she knows how to learn. And then in the early 80s, and the final recipe of the book is actually a nouvelle cuisine recipe. And she did that. I mean, she did say to me, God, I hated British version of nouvelle cuisine. It was ridiculous. So she would do larger portions. But she started to use orange juice and various other juices instead of cream. So it was very much a lighter dish. And the only person who finds the title of the last recipe, which I wrote using her information, funny, is me, and it's called Bela Lugosi's Fed.
Oh,
because it's for Bauhaus, you see. I'm the only person that finds that funny. But if you don't amuse yourself as you spend years writing a book, then
yes,
there we go.
And was that the final moment with your mother as well, leaving Rockfields?
Yes.
What year was that again?
That was end of 81, I believe, or beginning of 82. And then, that's it for her career at Rockfield. She just went on to other things. And Fritz, it was a rather lovely story. She was the first woman in the county to get a council mortgage, and she bought a cottage for, back then it was about £5,000.
Yes.
And she and Fritz just spent a year doing it up, because it really was a derelict cottage. There was no services, no running water, etc. So Fritz, being the Lancastrian that he was, he said, right, I'm going to do it myself. And so, because the music business is not working for me, so I'll do this. And he did. He quite clearly, he just built us a home to live in. That's where we lived for really the rest of the rest of Fritz's life, certainly.
God, that's such a sort of, it's like a Withnell and I moment of just leaving Rockfield, isn't it? That kind of, I always find it kind of gets my heart and kind of tear up a bit when those kind of chapters finish, because you realise that those, the gate or the door, and driving down that farm lane was probably it, really. Did you ever revisit Rockfield, is in later years?
Only recently, and it's been the most gorgeous thing. Because I moved to London, then I moved to America, and I did come back to the area. I don't live far away from it now, but I always felt a bit, I want to write what I want to write first before going back there. So I made contact with them about 2 years ago now, and it was as if no time had passed. And it has been 40 years, 38 years. But it was as if it was yesterday when we were last there. And I've just been shown such kindness. Kingsley is the one remaining brother who's still alive. He's still, rocking and booming. And his daughter, Lisa Ward, is the person who she runs the management of the studios now. And she let me stay there while I was drafting, and the Charlatans were there, and the Manics were just about to come in. So it's all still booming. But the other thing they do is they do tours of Rockfield. So the general public only, at the times they do the tours, can go around. So, like most, and it's still a farm, so like most farmers, they have to diversify. So that's what they're doing. But it is very much a working studio.
Blimey, that was 43 years ago you left. That was quite something.
God.
It is, oh my God, isn't it? It's, and I guess it must have such a lot of, I mean, those are such formative years, aren't they? That, they shape us so much, that childhood period. So did you ever feel, have you felt differently, over the decades since leaving? Did you, how did you feel kind of, not immediately, but after a little time, to how you feel now? Has your memory or feelings changed towards that period and chapter of your life?
I think going back to something and really getting down in the sandbox of it and pulling it apart and, digging down like an archaeologist, you realise how amazing it was and how special those moments were. Whereas before I would we as a family, we'd discuss Rockfield, the Rockfield families, and how much fun it was in those general ways. But we'd never, as a family, say, God, do you remember that moment when Fritz recorded Squeeze just for an RCA, what's it called, demo, and then it was shelved? Or do you remember that moment when, Lemmy's parents or his mum and stepfather came and mum had to deal with it? Or when the bikers, Fritz got the Hells Angels bike. We never discussed those things. But being able to look at it as a writer and think, okay, what is the scene? What happened on that day, at that moment? What is the full picture? And then not just my memories, but my mother's memories, Lisa's memories, Kingsley's memories, all of the research that I did, talking to other musicians, and really reading every article I could find, PhD theses about Rockfield as a studio. I mean, there's so much. And then having all that and realizing, I think everybody's past is special. So it was really, as particularly when you get to your 50s like me, and then putting it in that context was just a joyous process. It really was. And there's a lot of difficult stuff in the book too, because nobody's childhood is easy. But the overriding thing is not just music, but I suppose joy and love with a family.
Yes, lots of chat about dogs and animals, which is always, it keeps. Did you, when you were sort of not constructing your memories, but sort of putting pieces together, did you have to keep that, I'm writing this as the child, I'm not looking at it as did you have to keep thinking, okay, or did you have certain things that you thought, well, I can't quite remember it, but it's obviously happened, but it will make a nice bit in the book and I'll need to do this as that child, thinking it and remembering it, even though you think, I'm not quite sure, which is fair enough. I mean,
no, I think more of the first, in that when you've got to, well, you don't have to, but my process was trying to figure out what I felt about it as an adult, or as me now, Tiff now, but then very much putting myself in the shoes of that child and having to write it from that point of view only. And you've got to blinker that out. You've got to blinker any kind of apologia or, any kind of adult view or what it might mean or the significance, with a capital S. You've got to excise that with the drafting, but it will be there somewhere. Yes. You've got to get rid of it in the drafting process, because otherwise it doesn't seem authentic. It's not authentic to that moment. But the way that I do manage to bring an adult point of view into it is obviously between every chapter in my voice is my mother's voice. So it's my mother in the now, whatever that now is, as you know, the years go on,
Yes.
talking about her experience and giving a recipe. But they were interviews, so it's very much a monologue. It's a monologue in that moment that she's giving me. So you can put those two narratives together as a reader, and come up with your own. You know, that's what every book has to do, really. Give any kind of conclusion to the reader rather than foist it upon them.
That must have been a nice process, having a project to work with your mother, you know, to have that kind of almost an excuse, thinking, yeah, otherwise it's like, this is nice, but what's the point? But actually knowing that it's a definite part of what's going to create this book it must have been quite nice. Did it bring you a little bit closer together, or give you a certain sense of kind of, I don't know, filling in a holistic kind of not a relationship, but just a nice feeling of like, oh, this has been a really special time that we've had creating something that's going to be part of a book?
Yeah, it was, for me, it was. I think she felt, you know, slightly, oh God, Tiffany, we're not doing this again, are we? Because, you know, I come from an academic background, so I really want to be thorough about things. So I'm keep asking her the same questions of all the angles, because, you know, anybody who has read the book, who reads the book, will find out what kind of person she is. And she has no patience. She just wants to live her life now, which is fantastic. Really, I couldn't ask for more. But she's not interested in raking over the past. So trying to construct a memoir of her life was problematic just in the patience area for, you know, me trying to get it from her.
Yes.
That's the joy of a recorder. You can stop and start.
And also, I think with that generation, they do want to just get on. It's like, should we sit and have another? No, we've had enough tea. Let's get going. I got to dig the garden. It's like,
Whereas,
you know, yes, it's a very different world, and they've always got to be busy, and there's always an anecdote of a relative who always was busy, and if you sat down, they always appeared at the window and we'd be hit and said, have you got nothing to do? We've got some jobs for you. Think, oh, I've been found out again. It's like, it's a very different world, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, you can't just sit there.
Trying to, I mean, her version, as I said before, would be more kind of, I've got to go out to lunch, I've got to do that, I want to have a drink, you know, because she still loves a drink. And so trying to pin her down with that was you know, it was a battle, but it was a fun battle.
Yes. And you mentioned occasionally, you know, has there been much that you didn't include in the book, which was a little bit tricky? Did you think, no, that's a bit tricky? Was it because of wanting to write it as that child, or was it because actually you can remember it but thought, no, that's a bit too weird, so I better not put that in?
Well, I think it's true of every book. What you put in has to serve the story. And this is a story of music, a story of the time, a story of this particular place, and the story of a family coming together, and yes, against the odds and all of those things. Yes. So anything that didn't serve that story was extraneous and did have to come out. So there's not, you know, there's not a lot of me and us, Joan and Fritz, apart from Rockfield and apart from the vicarage. There is a little, and it's very important for the narrative, but apart from that, it just follows that line. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to follow that line, even if it jumped over years, so that at every point it's to do with music, and it's to do with a band, and to do with food, to do with recipes.
Absolutely. Oh, that's fantastic. And have you, since having it published, has it been well received, and have you had some nice feedback from people who've read it?
Yeah, I've been incredibly lucky. It was Sunday Times Book of the Week, Observer Book of the Day, The Week Book of the Week, Daily Mail Book of the Week. It's just reviewed in the TLS and the Irish Times. So it's crossing over the water, which I want to thank Horselips for, I think. So yeah, it's been really, really exciting, and I've been doing lots of festivals and events, and the, you know, readers have just been so generous.
Oh, that's fantastic. I do think it's a golden period, actually, because being, as you gathered, a bit of an 80s indie kid. You know, these things happen and you think, well, whatever. And then decades later, people are writing books and making exhibitions. They're doing films about various bits and pieces and are digging down to the most minute little details, which I love. So I think there's an interesting thing with the passing of time, you know, as I probably mentioned earlier, kind of reflecting and being kind of really important social history, because the 70s up to then would have just been the political parties and, you know, stuff about, you know, strikes, the 3-day week, all that kind of stuff. But that's only one part of the history of this country or the world. But then you get all these other stories, and that's what gives it such a lot of colour and intrigue. And Rockfield's is, you know, the iconic studio, isn't it? It's up there with Abbey Road, really. So it's
completely. And it's, you know, and it's, in my opinion, it still is, and in a lot of bands' opinions. I mean, bands like the Manics, who could go anywhere, but they always go back to Rockfield because it's their studio. And
it was the Charlatans who had a terrible time in the death of a member, wasn't it? That was Rockfield. And I think, was it the Stone Roses and people like that also start recording there as well? I think the Stone Roses famously were there for 18 months, which is insane and wonderful. That's a lot of cooking. There's a lot of cooking.
Yeah. And Oasis and
of course,
Coldplay. Oasis, it was Wonderwall there, and Coldplay, Look at the Stars. It's when Chris Martin was looking out at the sky outside Studio One in the quadrangle.
Oh, that was where there was literally the wall that Noel was sitting on, wasn't it, as well? So it's probably a tourist attraction. It's kind of incredible. It went from that 70s rock of, you know, Dave Edmunds and Hawkwind and Black Sabbath and Motorhead to, you know, the Manchester sound. So it's quite genius, really. So, there you go. Well, look, thank you ever so much for this. And it's lovely. Yes, Norwich. So much to answer for. It's great, isn't it? Oh, well, yes. I'm sure one day you'll have a walk around the streets of Unthank Road and go, oh, yeah, that was my place.
Oh, I miss Norwich.
The good old UEA, the lake, the walk around the lake.
Yes.
And the Sainsbury Centre. It's all very pleasant, actually. So it's graduation at the moment. So there you go. It's everyone's dressed up and looking beautifully optimistic. So it's really nice. Did you do all your graduation and gowns and everything?
I didn't actually. I was I've only ever done that once for my undergraduate degree. I should.
I think sometimes with a PhD, it's the following year, isn't it?
Yeah, and you think, oh well, I should, you know, I just never did. But I loved my time there. I really did.
Who were your supervisors?
It was back in the at UEA. It was back in the day. Andrew Motion, and yeah. That was it.
Andrew Motion.
Yeah.
That's quite an impressive one, wasn't it? Yeah, that's really... Because he did a book on mods, didn't he?
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read that.
I'll have to have a look.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, look. Oh, yes, it's got creative... Oh, you have to come to the Norwich Creative Writing Centre on King Street, because that's a whole...
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's amazing. That's really such a hub.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Oh, look, thank you ever so much for your time. And if you want, I can always send you the link and then you can use it on any of your social media platform sites. And that'd be fantastic.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been fantastic. Yes. And take care and have a lovely day.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
It's been a slow news week. Just joking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Oh, God. This morning, waking up to that.
Yeah. Oh, I know. No. I thought too much news in 1 week.
No, I know.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Listener, is the end of the interview. You probably gathered. Anyway, I like that last bit because, all of them, because there's always fudging and fumbling around, as I always do in life. Anyway, a massive thank you to Tiffany Murray for giving me the time for that interview, as we were talking about her new book, My Family and Other Rock Stars, available from all good bookshops and also online, probably. I'm sure it is. Anyway, it's a brilliant public read. Buy it. It will change your life. Anyway, this has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can. Indeed. As long as it's nice, obviously. On Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. And yes, all these interviews have been archived. So just go to C86 show. And there they are. Just like a magical moment. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.